Just to say, very warm welcome to Federation House for Federation Presents. As I'm sure you're aware, I mean, this is our talk that focuses on trying to look at how we can do things better in tech. The first thing I'd like to do this evening, of course, is to thank our sponsors, without which this would not be possible. And all of their names are listed there for you to see, but I would in particular like to mention Manchester City Council, who have just recently come on board as a sponsor, and we're really grateful for their support. And we have the Deputy Leader of the Council here this evening, so you're very welcome. So just to talk through just a few brief comments on what's going to happen. So after I finish up, we'll have Shannon Ballard, who we'll have from Silicon Valley, talk to us for her kind of keynote speech. After that, we'll be joined by the panel, and I'll be moderating a couple of questions from the audience. It's just having your opinions of various things, and then it'll be opened up to you guys because that's what it's really all about. So with further ado, I'd like to invite Emma to take the stage. Yeah.
Thank you all for coming out this evening. Thank you to the Federation and to all of the sponsors for inviting me here and making this evening possible. And let's just get into it then. So I'm here to talk about humanity and tech. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit through the lens of a book that I wrote a couple of years ago called Technology and the Virtues, a philosophical guide to a future worth wanting. And the book talks a lot about the particular challenges of this moment in technological development and the kinds of moral resources that we'll need to draw on in order to flourish in this new environment. But for this talk, I didn't want to just give the summary of my book, so I will gesture a few times to some key concepts in it. But I also wanted to have a conversation that really was about the theme of this evening, which is humanity and tech. And that concept of humanity is something that gets thrown around a lot in discussions of technology and ethics. And I think sometimes we don't think deeply about what that means and the extent to which our technologies are human or inhuman or humane. So that's going to be a key theme of my remarks tonight. So I'm going to start off just with a little video. I just want you to watch this for a second. This is a robot dentist in China that carried out the world's first fully autonomous dental surgery. And I want you to just think about this in the context of trust, which is something I'm going to talk about in a second. Thinking about what sort of trust it takes to interact with technology, especially the kinds of technologies that are becoming increasingly autonomous, increasingly automated, increasingly presented to us as able to care for our needs. In ways that typically we would only entrust to another human being. So thinking about the ways in which increasingly we're being asked to trust technology is important, and especially in an environment where public trust in institutions and public trust indeed in technology companies has been damaged in recent years. So we're in this very complex bind where we're being asked to place more trust in the institutions driving our technologies, in the institutions that are supposed to regulate our technologies, and yet the conditions under which we can trust seem to be more tenuous than ever. So one question then, what are we entrusting to technology today? What, if anything, should not be entrusted to technology is a question that I want to pose to you. What can we hope for from technology? To what extent can we be optimistic? What can we expect? And what must we demand of technology? And I think this is a really important question. Increasingly, we hear rhetoric that frames us as relatively passive and powerless with respect to technosocial change. We're told that the technologies will be transforming our society in this or that way. The robots will take over, or they won't, or these tools will be making decisions for us about our jobs, our freedom, our health. But I think that kind of rhetoric conceals what is still fundamentally a human choice. Those choices may not be up to us as individuals, but they still are up to us as a human family and as collectives and communities. And I think it's important not to forget that we still have this control and that it's up to us whether to be passive or not, or whether to demand certain things of technology that we have a right to demand from it. All right, so those are kind of the big abstract questions to frame this evening. Here's some just preliminary answers. Today we are entrusting, or being asked to entrust virtually everything to technology. We're entrusting our bodies. You saw in that video a moment ago. We're entrusting our voices, our reputations, our friendships, our money, our children, our votes, our food, our water, our freedom, and our future. And it's difficult to see what's not on this list that's of importance to us. And that should be, I think, a moment that should give us pause. Now, it might be that in many respects, some of these things, at least in part, are appropriately entrusted to certain technological systems. I certainly would not want to entrust the health of my body to a medical system that had no access to modern technology, right? I'm not really up for that. Likewise, I'm not sure I really want to entrust the safety of my food or the cleanliness of my water to a system that isn't at its core a technological system. So when I pose this question, I'm not saying we shouldn't trust these things to technology, but we should ask under what conditions ought we trust these things to technology, and what do we need to demand from the technology that cares for these things on our behalf? Because that's really what trust is. When we entrust someone with something, we're empowering them to care for it on our behalf. And we need to make sure they're competent to care for that thing. And I don't think we always ask that question with technology, or make those distinctions between what a technology is capable of caring for and what it isn't. Okay, here's something I think that I want to emphasize tonight. One thing that I can tell you that technology is not capable of caring for on our behalf, something we should not entrust to it now, or I think ever, is our own humanity. And again, that concept of humanity needs to be unpacked, and I'll say a bit more about what I mean in a moment. So I'll just let this be a temporary teaser here. I think we must also hope to gain the courage and wisdom to use our technosocial power well. That was what I gestured to a moment ago about not being passive, not allowing ourselves to be taken in by the rhetoric of technological determinism that suggests that we can simply not hope to have any power or control over our technological or technosocial destiny. And I think that's a mistake. I think that with the appropriate courage and wisdom, we can indeed gain some measure of control. And I think we must demand technology that is humane. And in a few moments, I'm going to draw this distinction between what is human and what is humane. And I think that's a really important distinction to make. Because the concept of humanity really is ambiguous. In a sense, anything that human beings individually or collectively do is part of our humanity. And that includes everything we do with technology, right? Technology is not inhuman. Technology has been interwoven with our humanity since the very beginning, right? Since we started making tools, since we started using rocks to make our food more accessible. And we've always used technology to manifest our values in the world. There's nothing new. There's nothing inhuman about technology. In fact, to imagine humanity without technology, I think, is an incoherent idea. So in that sense, humanity covers everything. And there can be nothing in technology, it would seem, that goes against our humanity. But there's another sense of humanity, another meaning to the word humanity that I think is different. And that's this notion of humanity is what is humane. And not everything that is human is humane. The concept of something humane is an aspirational concept. It has to do with what we can make of ourselves that we are not already, and what we can aspire to become, what we can hope for our children to become, what we can build institutions in the hope of creating. And I think when we talk about technology and humanity, I think what we really ought to keep a focus on is what humane technology would look like, and what technology that would in fact preserve what is humane and enrich what is humane in our world, what that would look like. And I think that's what we have a right to demand. So today's technology, as I gestured to a moment ago, is human. In fact, in some ways, it's all too human. I'm going to give you an example that some of you may have read about. This was a news story just a couple days ago. So the New York Times published a story talking about a study that suggested that Facebook Facebook use seemed to be strongly correlated with anti-refugee violence in Germany. And the statistic that got the most coverage is here. Wherever per person Facebook use rose to one standard deviation above the national average, attacks on refugees increased by about 50%. That's a pretty shocking statistic. The researchers found a Facebook-specific effect, so it didn't seem to be correlated with overall internet use. It also was something they seemed to demonstrate had some robustness as a finding, because they were able to go back and look at instances where Facebook had gone down in those communities as a result of technical outages. And they found a strong correlation in those communities where Facebook was very high, that when Facebook became inaccessible, the rate of attacks on refugees dropped significantly. And they dropped at the same rate at which heavy Facebook use is thought by the authors of the study to boost violence. Okay, there's a lot to say about this story, and of course it's just one study and would need to be replicated and so on, but let's just take it on face value for a moment. There's nothing about this that's inhuman. In fact, the study goes on to describe the social dynamics of social psychology that are being activated by these patterns of heavy Facebook use, involving, for example, the activity of super posters, people who are extremely active on Facebook, much more so than the average person, who are then read by other more casual users as signals of what the community as a whole believes. And the researchers talk about the fact that this is a known dynamic of social psychology that occurs in all kinds of contexts in which social media is not a factor, right? But these patterns, these social dynamics, are being activated and amplified by that platform. It's not that the technology was designed to do this, of course not. And it's not even that the technology itself alone is to blame. It's human social dynamics that are causing this. But what we're not paying attention to is the extent to which our technologies either strengthen and amplify our humane tendencies, or they make them harder to access and harder to sustain. Okay, so how did we get here? How did we get to a world where ethics seems to be something that is a profound need in technology, that the innovations that we've developed seem to have created some sort of ethical vacuum in our society? Okay, so I think here's some of the mistakes that we made. First, by seeing ethics and innovation as antagonists, right? So this idea, this very false idea that ethical innovation is an oxymoron, right? That ethics is somehow an impediment to innovation. This could not be further from the truth, right? And yet, for a while, this was just a sort of background assumption of a lot of people, that ethics was a way of saying, no, don't build that. No, don't build that either. Nope, can't build that. As opposed to thinking of ethics as a way of figuring out what to build and for whom, and with what structures around it to ensure that it promotes humane values. Another thing we got wrong is seeing innovation as doing the work of ethics. So many of you have seen the word innovation used in a context where what is really meant is progress, right? But progress and innovation are not the same thing. Innovation is, I built something new to do this thing. Progress is, it does it better. And better is a normative term. In philosophy speak, that just means it has an ethical connotation, right? And so innovation does not automatically do the work of ethics. It does not guarantee that the things that we're building are in fact progress. And we've also made the mistake of seeing ethics as something rigid and not forward-looking, right? For a while in Silicon Valley, it's very common to reject ethical reflection as something that was rooted in tradition, that was rooted in doing things the old way, that was rooted in doing things without technology. The idea being, no, we're past that, right? We don't need ethics anymore because we have the future. But ethics has always been forward-looking. Ethics has always been about planning for the future and figuring out how to attain in the future the kind of world that we want. So in that sense, ethics and innovation should always have been seen as mutually reinforcing. We also have treated, as I've said, innovation as something that happens to us rather than change that we choose in ways that reveal our values. So this notion that technology determines our future for us, that it just comes at us and then we adapt, right? And we hear this all the time with the kind of things that founders often say, right? We have to adapt or die. Innovation, disruption is inevitable. We have to merge, here's Elon Musk, right? We have to merge with the machines and become irrelevant. These are just different ways of encouraging us to accept technological change as something that is decided for us, and not something for which we are responsible or for which we can hold others responsible. And I think that's a very dangerous message. Okay, so how can we get it right? We can see innovation as a mode of ethics, a way of building the world that we want. Another way of saying that is you would also see ethics as a mode of innovation. I really think it's important that we get used to posing ethical questions in technical spaces and vice versa. Not treating, for example, the field of STEM as something that can stand alone, but rather something that exists only in a social and political context. And likewise, we can't do ethics, we can't work in the humanities without paying attention to the ways that science and technology are changing our world. So as much as I see sometimes students in science and mathematics and engineering who really are uncomfortable in discussions around humanistic concepts, I just as often see students in humanities who say things like, oh, I hate science, or I don't like technology, or I'm not interested in that. And I don't think we have that luxury anymore on either side, right? We have to bring these questions together. They belong together. They always have. I think we also have to take more responsibility for the values and ideals that our design choices reflect. And that's something, I think all these things, by the way, are lessons that in the past year we're starting to learn, right? These are things that are already happening more in the last 6 months than they have ever before. So that's a very encouraging development. But I think we have to sustain this. And this has to be the new way that we do innovation going forward. Okay, just a little background. I'm going to refer to a certain mindset called technocracy that I think has been the kind of dominant ideology up till now in Silicon Valley and many other centers of innovation in the world, and something that I think we are now learning we need to question. Okay, so before 2016, here was the conventional wisdom. The internet makes us more connected, and therefore more likely to collaborate and cooperate. The internet improves our access to information, and therefore enhances knowledge and wisdom. The internet gives everyone a platform to be heard. Therefore, it's an inherently democratic force. The internet enables global sharing of diverse experiences and values, so it will make us more open, more tolerant, and compassionate. Now, what's interesting is 2.5 years ago, if I had said those things, there would not be this broad snickering in the audience, right? We would have had a very, very different reaction. There would have been a lot of nodding heads. All right, so what happened? Well, look, here's a great quote that just kind of exemplifies this mentality from Eric Schmidt and Jared Cohen in The New Digital Age from 2015. They told us that with so many people connected in so many places, the future will contain the most active, outspoken, and globalized civil society the world has ever known. The newfound ability to obtain accurate and verified information online in native languages and in endless quantity will usher in an era of critical thinking in societies around the world. Okay, well, yeah. Okay, so. Time to retool, right? So what's the new status quo? Everything is fake news. You don't like what you hear, it's fake news. Growing distrust in pretty much all institutional forms of authority, scientific authority, media authority, political authority. Weakened faith in democratic values, which has been shown to be growing in young people particularly, which is rather disturbing. Fragility of public norms and institutions. The rise of political, cultural, and economic filter bubbles. Uncertainty about human alliances. And so, how did we get to this point? Well, first of all, I think we have to remember that digital media strive to deliver a customized, idealized, and frictionless online experience. But few of us really foresaw the consequences for civic life and civic character. I mean, I think one thing to remember is that democracy always came with a price. It was always going to be more chaotic and less ideal than the perfect society, right? The problem is that the perfect society is always seemingly an authoritarian one. And so the price of democracy is that we willingly surrender the hope for a frictionless and ideal society, right? We've had plenty of science fiction dystopias to remind us that there is no freedom in a perfect society, that these ideas don't seem to be conceptually coherent. So the idea is that instead we cultivate the civic virtues and public norms that we need to manage our inevitable conflicts, so that we may preserve our freedom, so that we may preserve what is humane in our ideals. But we reneged on a deal, right? We wanted to have our cake and eat it too. We wanted to have the comfort of the filter bubble. We wanted to have the comfort of believing what pleases us or what confirms what we already think to be true. And so I think there's some ingredients to this development that have been kind of developing for a long time, well before the rise of Facebook. Dynamics that predate what we call the digital age that we need to pay attention to. Certainly this is true in the United States. I know that the dynamics are different in the UK and Europe, but I think globally public education for civic and humane virtues has been declining for a while. An investment in that element of public education, I think, has really suffered. There's been much more emphasis, right, on public education for either vocational expertise or for technical expertise that is tightly specialized. And this is partly because our market incentives and our political incentives have become increasingly misaligned with the ideals of a humane future, right? And this is why so many of us are frustrated that even when we see the problems, we don't know how to fix them because the economic incentives and the political incentives seem to punish anyone who would try to do the right thing, right? Or try to design a better system. And then finally, I do think that the internet's immense potential to enrich the public sphere, which was real, right? Wasn't all a lie, wasn't all an illusion, has been largely squandered, in part as a result of narrow and short-sighted technocratic solutionism, which is basically a way of taking complex social and political problems with all of their complex dynamics and thinking that a technology can fix it, right? That you don't need social solutions or political solutions. You use technical solutions to solve social and political problems. And I think that we've learned, unfortunately, the naivete of that sort of solutionism. So we need to find a better way forward. Okay, what might that look like? All right, yeah, I'll just mention that the part of the problem of technological solutionism, which has this sort of rhetoric of, you know, if we build the tools, they will come to the humane habits and virtues that we want to promote. We kind of forget that something that Bertrand Russell, one of the great philosophers of the 20th century, one of the great philosophers of all time, told us, which is that without civic morality, communities perish. And that without personal morality, their survival has no value. So the question I'm going to pose to you is this. do you think that our current path of technosocial development is taking us to a future where humanity can truly flourish and not merely survive? How many people think we're on the right path, right? Basically just keep everything the way it is, push forward, and we will get to the kind of future that we want.
Not a shared idea of the future that we want. Is there such thing as a right path?
That is an excellent question, right? And who is we, right? Good, okay. Can I come back to that? Yes, okay. But let me say this, I do think there are some certain fundamental needs of the human animal that are shared by all of us. And I think if we look at, for example, the environmental challenges that we're facing, as well as the rise of inequality that no one seems to be able to do anything about, I think we can see that the sort of, even the basic sort of biological conditions for human flourishing that we all share are hard to imagine being met if we stay on our current trajectory. But I think you raise a very important question about the specifics of the future we might want. Okay, I'll come back to that. So a lot of people talk about technology in the context of existential risk. People like Elon Musk and Stephen Hawking talked about this a lot. But they always talk about it in terms of robots that are going to come and enslave us and decide that we're not worth survival. I don't worry about that. I don't worry about robot overlords. I don't worry about the Terminator scenarios. But there are existential risks that I think come from a very different sort of technological prospect. And existential risks are basically any risk to a form of existence that would be worthwhile. So I think we can think about prospects where humans survive. I mean, we're pretty wily creatures, right? I mean, we're kind of in, I imagine we're somewhat into the cockroaches in that, we tend to eke out survival in pretty harsh conditions. But I want to call out this motto. This was a motto that's structured to in a great book I read recently, Station 11, by Emily St. John Mandel. And it's about a sort of post-apocalyptic society. And there's a traveling group of theater artists putting on plays in town to town in the middle of this sort of post-apocalyptic wasteland. And the question is, why would there be a sort of traveling theater troupe in this kind of world? And it's because, and they have in the book, they have it sort of marked on their wagon, and one of them has a tattoo that says survival is insufficient. This idea that to be humane requires something more than just surviving. It requires some kind of flourishing. By the way, the author says that it was this, it was an episode of Star Trek Voyager that she found this phrase and incorporated it into the book because she found it so powerful. Okay, so we have these popular visions of our future with robot overlords and super intelligence, humans with no jobs, the WALL-E dystopia, we're also lazy, that we basically have lost all of our humane capacities. I don't worry too much about these kinds of scenarios, but I think there are other kinds of more realistic futures that we can imagine heading towards right now that we ought not want. There are also hopes, right? People talk about AI and the power to amplify our humanity, to liberate us from the constraints of need and want and work. The prospect of AI-human partnerships, the recovery of leisure, right? We'll finally get to that point where technology gives us more time with our families and not less. A new age of reason, right? And I think it's healthy to think about a positive future with technology and the ways in which technology could promote a humane future. But I think, again, we have technologies that are very human, but we don't have a lot of technologies today that are truly humane. And it has to do with that misalignment of incentives that I was talking about. And also a decline even in talking about what is humane. This was a concept that was the preoccupation of many communities in many periods of human history in different ways. So the ancient Greeks were very concerned with this kind of notion of what is truly noble in the human animal and what can be brought out through our habits. The classical Confucian tradition and the Buddhist tradition talk very much about this notion of ways to bring out what is humane in an animal that is already quite human. The European Enlightenment was very much invested, right, in this notion of culture that built up something humane out of something that was merely human. And yet in the 20th and 21st centuries, that sort of discourse has really evaporated and been replaced by something else. I think it's time to bring it back. So what kind of future with machines is worth wanting? So it's clear, I think, from everything I've said, that I think we ought to want a humane future, and that anything less than that is insufficient. Now, can new technologies like AI help to bring us there? I think they can, if they are developed in a humane context. I think that's what we don't yet have, is the context in which to develop these technologies properly. But look, here are some skills that what we call artificial intelligence today, right, which is a bit of a misnomer, not really intelligent at all. AI today can't do any of these things. And that's great, because these are pretty cool things for humans to do, right? A job in which you do some combination of these things, or all of these things, is the kind of job that doesn't feel much like work, right? It's the kind of thing that not only is unique to human capacity, but also potentially the most rewarding for humans. And yet there are very few jobs in the world that humans are allowed to do in which these are the primary skills being called upon, right? Most of the jobs in the world that humans have are jobs in which we are asked not to be humane, but to be mechanical, right? To be predictable, to be efficient, to be fast, to be precise. Well, look, these aren't things that humans are good at. We are not so great at repetition, calculation, statistical analysis, and prediction. And we don't get much better at these things either, right? I mean, humans just seem to evolve in such a way that our cognitive biases and our heuristics are somewhat limited. And that's why things like systems like AlphaGo are so amazing, because they're not confined to our cognitive heuristics, and they can find paths to solutions to problems that a human would never see, right? So if we can use AI in ways that capitalize on its mechanical strength, its ability to do things that are efficient, its ability to do things that are routine and involve accuracy and predictive power, that's fantastic, because that could free us to cultivate creative, social, ethical, and critical skills, the things that bridge the gaps between what machines can do and what we can do. The very skills that we need to invent more humane and just forms of life. If you look at what the classical Greeks and the Confucians and the Buddhist tradition and the Enlightenment tradition, as diverse as those are, and by the way, to your point, they don't agree about what the good life would be for a human being, right? Nor need they. But they all actually are calling upon these skills. And every moral tradition and every culture that has had some ideal of a humane future has called upon these kinds of skills. The problem is that the demands of production typically have required us to develop other kinds of skills, those skills that now machines are capable of performing increasingly. So there is this future one can imagine, right, in which machines free humans to finally be humane. But right now, that's not the system that we have, and that's not how we're using these technologies. So if we choose, the future of human society with intelligent machines can be more humane than ever. But right now, we're on a very different path. And the road is full of potholes, it's very steep, we're going rather fast, there's lots of curves, and we're not even sure who's driving the bus. And so I think we really have to think about the fact that the future that we might want, one in which machines exist to serve and enrich humane values, and ideally in a plurality of different ways. That future won't happen organically. It's not the path that we're on. It will need to be a choice that we make to take a different path. So the question I have is, will we rise to the occasion and seize this opportunity? Or will political, economic, and moral inertia lead us to make the same short-sighted mistakes that we've made with past technology, whether it's pesticides or plastics or CO2 emitters, right? So this is the choice that we face today. And this is going to require action by corporations, by lawmakers, by schools. We're going to have to, for example, invest in new skills training for roles that blend technical and social and ethical intelligence, as opposed to seeing these as two separate tracks. We have to be flexible enough then to adapt our educational and economic habits to this need. What's most problematic is we have to do this quickly. The window for making this adjustment is relatively short, because the problems that are facing us, environmental problems, political challenges, economic challenges, we need people with these skills to meet those challenges fast. And so we need action quickly from our institutions to meet that need. And if we don't, the result will be underinvestment in human guidance of technology, degraded safety and performance of new technology, damaged public trust in science and technology, and diminishing odds of a technologically advanced civilization that flourishes and not merely survives. And this, unfortunately, I think is where we are right now, right? With these being the effects that we're seeing. But there is time to reverse course. So the claim of my book links up to all this, I think. The claim of my book is this: if humanity is to have any real hope of not merely surviving, but flourishing in the 21st century and beyond, then we're going to need something more than just better machines, right? So technological solutionism is that answer. We just need to build the better machines. We need better humans. And what I mean by that is humans with the humane capacities that I'm talking about, the humane skills and virtues to manage technosocial power wisely and well. Now, there are some objections, right? Why do we need better humans? We survived just fine up till now, just as we are, even with all our short-sighted, selfish, and tribalistic vices. And hasn't it been unfettered technological progress and not moral and humane wisdom that has guaranteed human survival at this point? You can probably figure out what my answers are. First of all, technological progress is not the same thing as social progress. They're not unrelated, right? But their relationship is complicated. And also, I think we have to recognize that the kind of power that technology has given us in the 20th and 21st century is something that we've never seen before. We've never had the power to destroy the conditions for human survival or human flourishing on this planet before with our technologies. And we have that power today. So when human vice is coupled with explosive growth in technosocial power, human survival is no longer assured. And as I've said, even if it was, mere survival is insufficient, and it always has been. So how have the wisest humans of the past managed to accomplish something better than mere survival? What allows a human animal to become something humane? So we have this legacy in moral philosophy, this legacy of self-cultivation. This is a very blurry image of a book by Stanley Cavell, which talks about the tradition in American philosophy of Emersonian perfectionism. This is just one example of many of these kinds of traditions, which are all dedicated to seeking what Cavell calls our further, next, unattained but attainable selves, that notion of the humane ideal that lies in the future. And this is just an example of all of the different cultural traditions that have embraced that ideal. Right? So this is not a narrowly Western conception of the good life. This notion of a humane future and something that can be crafted through the art of self-cultivation is actually resonant across cultures. And that's something I developed in my book quite extensively. So I'm talking here about virtue ethics. these traditions of moral self-cultivation and practical wisdom. You see them in the ancient Greek, Confucian, and Buddhist world, but these are just 3 examples. There are many traditions of virtue ethics across many different cultures that have developed this kind of concept. And what I talked about in my book is that even though, and this is to your point, sir, about we don't all share the same idea of what the future should look like and the kind of future we would want. What's very interesting is that as I did my research, I found that the traditions had a fair amount of agreement, not about what a good person is or what a good future is, but about the kinds of skills and practices that humans have to develop in order to attain whatever that humane ideal is that they've identified. And these practices of moral habituation, understanding of relationships to a very deep level, the practice of reflective self-examination, the ability to intentionally direct your own moral development as opposed to passively have it shaped by others, a capacity to pay moral attention to the ethically salient features of the world around you, the ability to apply prudential judgment to challenging situations where the rules of your society don't give you adequate guidance, and the ability to appropriately extend moral concern beyond the sphere of those that you're naturally predisposed to give it to, right? Whether it's beyond the family or the tribe. But all of these traditions talk about extending your moral concern past that point. And I think that it's really interesting then to look at this kind of resonance across cultures of ways to develop those humane virtues. And I think these are the practices that we need to return to cultivating in our communities. And I think it's less important that we agree on what the future should look like down to fine detail than it is that we dedicate ourselves to recultivating those skills and virtues that will allow us to get to those futures. And so that's what I call in the book a technomoral virtue ethic, contemporary practical wisdom for living well with emerging technologies. Bina, how are we doing for time? Okay, great. I'm not going to go through these in detail. These are some of the virtues that I talk about in the book that I discuss in each case in the techno-moral context, which is just a fancy way of saying, in the context of a world in which our chances for flourishing are profoundly shaped by technology. So I identified 12 virtues. I could have identified fewer, I could have identified more. I think these are all virtues that our present circumstances demand that we begin to cultivate. I think it's interesting to think about the ways in which some of the mistakes we've made in the past result from a failure to cultivate these kinds of virtues. So this is, again, I seem to be beating up on Eric Schmidt. Sorry about that, Eric. He said, but I love this because he was very honest, right? He said last year, he said he confessed, we keep finding ourselves having to fix the internet and its platforms over and over again. And he said, you guys keep saying to us, why didn't we think about this? And he says, well, the answer is it didn't occur to us that there were criminals, right? Which I think is a great sort of striking confession. Of course, also didn't occur to the technologists that there were pathological liars, con artists, racists, sexists, other people of deeply vicious character, right? So I think it's interesting to ask what sort of virtues are missing or immature in technologists who don't foresee that their designs might fail for non-technical reasons or be adapted for deeply antisocial purposes. I certainly don't think that Eric Schmidt or any other technologists who were instrumental in developing these platforms wanted them to be taken over by criminals or wanted them to be taken over by racists, right? So what sort of virtues then are required in order to see that possibility? You have to have humility. You have to be willing to think about the ways in which your designs might fail, right? You have to believe that what you're building might not turn out the way you want, right? And so if you have the attitude of we're the smartest people in the room, everything we build will be for social benefit, good intentions aren't enough. You have to have the humility to be able to think about where those failure points might be. You have to have empathy. You have to be able to understand how your tools might affect people outside of your community. This is one of those issues that we're facing in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, where there's a profound lack of diversity in the design teams, in the product management teams, in the leadership. And that lack of diversity means not that people don't want to have empathy, it's that it's hard to have empathy when you don't have that perspective in the room, right? When no one's there to share that perspective, how can you be expected to understand it and to empathize with it? So an ability to understand more broadly the stakeholders and the different people who are being affected by our platforms is really important. That sort of broader perspective, being able to be outside your filter bubble and see the situation as a whole, not just see your technology and not just see the ideal circumstance in which you'd like it to be employed, but see all of the social and political and criminal and economic dynamics that are going to interact with your technology, and try to think about that on a systems basis. And that practical wisdom to be able to adapt when things start to go wrong, to realize when the plan is unraveling and be able to respond very quickly in creative ways. I'm going to skip this case study for time, but it basically has to do also with the way that some of our marketing of technology fails to show the proper kinds of virtues. For example, when we describe robots as having emotions and as being capable of loving us or understanding us, we really fail to apply virtues like honesty and care to what we're doing. Okay, and then there's also the positive case studies, right? Things like virtual reality genres that are being developed specifically to try to cultivate greater empathy, to bring about motivations to restore justice to those who have been denied it, to promote moral perspective and imagination. Now, I think we have to be cautious and not think, again, virtual reality is not going to fix us. Virtual reality by itself is just a tool. But we can use our tools to foster humane virtues, and that's a future that I think that we can embrace. Okay, so we have to beware the false promise of techno fixes, but technologies have to be part of our ethical and political approaches to social challenges. And it will be the civic character of people living with and through our technologies that will determine whether we flourish together with them. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Shannon. We'll have some opportunities for questions, obviously, in a few minutes. But in the meantime, I'd like to invite our panelists to come up. We can just get them to get started. So guys, do you want to introduce yourself briefly? Just say who you are.
Yeah, sure. My name's Sarah. I joined Omnigine Network recently. We're proud members of the Federation. And we work to invest and co-create everything from tools to communities that work to make things more sensible. And criticise the Google for 8 years. I'm partly in engineering, partly running space entrepreneurs. So hopefully I can bring a bit of that experience to this conversation. Simon?
Hi, I'm Simon Steer from BGSS. I lead our innovation practice. I feel like I'm an evil technology technologist. I help organisations use emerging technologies to develop new, hopefully human solutions.
My name is Ella Fitzsimmons. I came this over here because I did some work for Bob Digital about a year ago. I'm a strategist and narrator, which is one of those sort of nebulous terms, which really means that I work with words a lot, but I also work with tech teams. So one of the things that I work a lot on is helping tech teams work out how they talk about what they do, and also how that informs what they end up building and doing.
Right. Well, I think we're just waiting to get the panelists' names up, are we? We're flicking through the rest of Shannon's. We're getting a speed read through the rest of your presentation. Yeah, so I just wanted to ask a couple of questions. Shannon, you mentioned a comment, a phrase in your presentation, the new civic status quo, where you pointed out about uncertainty and fake news, threats to our democracy. So I'll ask Shannon first, but I'd like all the panelists to give me their opinions. It's quite a destabilizing, almost, the uncertainty is very threatening to us, I think, as human beings, and at a personal level, you're all involved in researching these areas. Is there a kind of mental health consequence to try to think through or to try and grapple with those kind of uncertainties? Sorry, Shannon.
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be overwhelming, simply the scale of the challenges and the number of them and the different levels of society at which they manifest themselves. But I think one of the things that I have embraced as a way of kind of preserving my optimism and my sense of purpose in this kind of work is just to embrace the growing community of people who are really trying to accomplish these shared goals. And that's been really wonderful to see the way in which not just in academia, but in the technology sector, among policymakers, activists, there's just this vast community of people now that see the nature of the challenge and are really rising to meet it. So it's possible then to divide and share the labor in ways that I think 5 years ago it was a little more difficult to do. And I think that sense of cooperation in this cause is something that's growing and really allowing those of us who are working to meet these challenges to be much more hopeful.
Right. I would echo that. I think, you know, I read this Economist piece this week talking about 30% of only 30% of Americans think democracy is essential, which is quite a lot of stats. And you can extrapolate the other 70% what they're looking for. Is it convenience? Is it wealth? Is it stability? But what's really interesting to me is some of these conversations we were having 5 years ago. These problems are not themselves totally new, but I would argue they've been bubbling up for a very long time. So a couple of companies we're working with in the States, including Coworker, who are doing a lot of really great work to galvanize technical leads and help them push back on things like project management at Google, things like the ICE contract at Microsoft. And to Shannon's point, what gives me energy and keeps me optimistic is communities like this. If you think about it, it's raining Wednesday night. You're out of your houses talking about this topic that can be quite draining and quite complicated. But again, this is a really good conversation that we have to have because all of us have a really good stake in how we live in the future. And that to me makes me still quite optimistic about this problem. And that's our ability to kind of at least be thoughtful about the challenges we're facing.
Simon?
I don't think I'm that anxious about it, if I'm honest, which might be, I think a lot of people are talking about it. I think maybe almost too many people are kind of getting anxious about it, I guess, in a way. So I think as a human and civil society, we've always had politics, we've had Cold War, we've had, you know, lots of things that we go through over time. I think there are bigger things that I'm personally more worried about. So you know, we've got huge monopolies now, we've got Amazon using technology to dominate lots of different markets, and I think over the next couple of years, those types of things will become more disruptive in our society than some of the kind of ethical things around individual technologies. But I mean, it's connected because it is civil kind of, you know, how do we design and how do we manage and have laws and regulations. My worry is the technology is the regulations behind, the governments behind, law makers behind, and actually they're the things that keep us cohesive as society, is that respect for law keeping up with technology.
Yeah, I guess similarly, I think part of my, I think there's lots of things to be very, very worried about per se, but, you know, I was took fun of your slide that you had about where everybody sort of snickered a little bit. And I was like, actually, you know what, it is also true, right? Like it is also, and I think one of the things that we've seen in the last couple of years is that the internet actually does both things.
Yes. And that's so hard about it, right? It does both.
Right, and so it polarizes, but it definitely polarizes both good and bad. And I think what we're seeing at the moment, I think it's brilliant that we're seeing more attention to technological ethics and into the platforms and what the regulations should look like. I absolutely think that's really beneficial. I think there is at the moment, at least in the UK, a little bit of a press pile-on onto making everything the tech giants' faults. And in part that's because they are these huge semi-unregulated monopolies. But a lot of the problems we see around it, and you touched on that in your talk as well, are problems of funding, of late capitalism, of extreme shareholder data extraction, those sorts of problems. And I think we also need to talk about that. I think one of the reasons we need to do that is that so it stops being, so it doesn't become something that only women complain about in the tech space because it's the only time people will listen to us, is if we're talking about morality and ethics, for example. So that's fine.
Great. Does anybody in the audience want to ask a question at this point? Julie?
Yeah, I love the talk, and I've read the book a lot of this as well. I'm quite interested in the role of the corporation within this, because, especially in America, I'm quite interested in the role of the corporation within this, because they have their own identities. In the sense, you have corporate morality. And you start seeing, that you mentioned about these kind of super large monopolies that tend to have their own characteristics and traits. So how does this virtuous outlook, how does that engage with them? Can the corporations become virtuous? Is that?
You asked a really fantastic question, and in fact, that was a colleague of mine who was very complimentary about my book. Said, "This is the next book I want you to write." Is the question of how virtue can be embodied in these large institutional structures and organizations, because that's a real part of the challenge that we're facing today. And I think certainly when Aristotle and Confucius were talking about virtue in leadership, they were thinking about the single, in the case of Confucius, the single prince or king, or in the case of Aristotle, you know, a body of 500 Greek men, right? And I think the idea of, you know, figuring out what does virtue look like for a corporation that may have, you know, for example, Google has 85,000 people. What does that look like? Spread all over the world, operating in different cultural contexts, right, and different political systems. How can you have any kind of coherence, identity or character under those conditions? And it may be that thinking about organizations as virtuous may not be the right level of analysis, but thinking about whether the leadership of those organizations have policies and systems and incentives that allow the expression of virtue in design, that allow the expression of virtuous choices in marketing. And part of that is also recognizing, I think as you gestured to, that there's this broader context behind the corporation. And for a long time, for example, in the United States, corporations had the comfort, in a way, of knowing that they would be restrained by the government from acting in significant ways against the public interest. Of course, there were all kinds of imperfect implementations of that. But in general, corporations were allowed to pursue single-minded profit, in part because the legal structure wrapped around them prevented that, in some cases, from being too destructive to the public interest. And what you have with deregulation, right, is the removal of those restrictions, but the preservation of the same incentives. And it shouldn't be surprising that you see corporations, you know, in some ways very frustrated. They're answerable to their shareholders, right? Their shareholders believe, in many cases, that they have a right to expect profit at all costs. And yet, corporations are also being blamed for acting in ways that are damaging to the public interest. So I think you do have to think about the whole system in which these corporations exist, and how can you create the right kinds of incentives for them to act in ways that are socially beneficial.
Yeah, but so I agree with that. It's all about moral compass and having that direction. If you put a massive magnet by the side of that compass and deviate it, and that's, you know, where profit comes in. So you know, it's about regulation. So the Great Depression and the more recent depression, the recession, it was about deregulation, where people weren't held to account, and investment banks kind of just went crazy. So you know, these big corporations should welcome regulation so that they can have that moral compass. But I think that they're fighting it. They're just, you know, there was a previous talk where, you know, Google and others were fighting regulation with definitely unethical means, and they should welcome it.
I really don't think that there's another level of complexity there as well, because I think you're absolutely right about the need for regulation in terms of boundary setting, but I think for most of the Silicon Valley founders now, they're born between 75 and 85. You know, they grew up in this era of utopianism, Web 1.0, of, you know, and I think a lot of those founders, a lot of those founding executives do believe, and this is a cognitive dissonance, that what they're doing is right for the world. And it's only in the last year that 19% level of practice, 19% level of consumer trust dropping. You know, I still think there's a piece there where some of these founders are not as yet convinced that what they're building is unethical. And I think that to me is really interesting, is, you know, I think that's an element we don't think about enough, is that for many people they still believe what they want is positive. And I think that's where the need for virtuous thinking can really
But I think some of those things that, you know, that are, you know, more about corporates than the technology itself, because, you know, there's the kind of the moral obligation, if you like, of society to pay taxes on profit. You could put that up as a kind of universal kind of truth that we all assume is right. But all of the technology companies use offshore accounts and they devious ways to kind of not pay taxes in the countries where they're making those profits. And so they know that's unethical. You know, it's not breaking the law, but it's breaking a moral code of some kind, isn't it?
Then I guess there's a piece there around, I'm not disagreeing with you at all, but I'm thinking of, for example, in the UK and Ireland, particularly Ireland, you know, Ireland wants to travel tech companies there, but they don't have the regulation in place. And to me, there's, you know, that's why the government should step in, clearly, because if you're a company and that's, you know, whatever industry you're in, there should be very strict boundaries around this level of tax you pay. If you look at the, you know, the tax the NHS pays in the UK versus Amazon, the NHS is paying this much, Amazon is paying this much. So I think there's something there that the government should settle more.
So that comes back to regulation, the law, the structure as a society that we expect to be in place to hold them accountable, isn't it?
Ella,
Yeah, I guess I had another part of that actually, which is that even beyond sort of regulation and those sort of things, I think one of the things that we are seeing and where like, maybe the press, which has really, I think, failed in holding a lot of these corporations to account and in holding the failure of regulation to account, is helping, is that if this becomes a reputational risk for a lot of those companies, if this starts to affect their bottom line, then I really think it, you know, whether or not, like I think self-regulation is really struggling. I think external or basically hasn't happened, depending on how cynical we want to be. You know, external regulation is slow, and often a really one tool. And I think that sort of reputational regulation will be an interesting one. And I think it will also be an interesting one in bringing slightly different people into these big tech corporations, as you said in your talk.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, you know, recently Microsoft came out with a public call for regulation of facial recognition technology. It'll be interesting to see if there is any sort of shift coming in the attitudes of the larger corporate actors about regulation, because I think increasingly they are suffering this reputational threat, but they face competition with smaller companies that don't have the same brand to protect. And so there may be an incentive coming for a lot of the larger corporations that are seeing their brands be damaged to call for more regulation so that the playing field is leveled so that they can afford to act in ways that won't damage the brand without being undercut by companies that don't have the same reputation to protect.
Also, what's interesting there is we're working with Twitter on alongside the Microsoft thing, we're working with Twitter around defining healthy metrics and looking at how to measure some of the specific skills online. So at the moment, Twitter is measuring itself on monthly active users and etc., which doesn't incentivize great behavior. And what I think is really interesting is these companies have realized they can't build this in-house. They're doing it and call it stunning. I think that's a really interesting, that kind of drives the process in a really interesting way of trying to problem solve in a different way.
One of the other questions that has always intrigued me is language and use of language that technology companies use. So, you know, Airbnb is be at home, anywhere, or, you know, we have Apple referring to their stores as town squares. So just to go back to Aristotle, I don't really, that's what he had in mind of the word democracy, that, you know, which is about by an iPhone. So, you know, the co-opting of language. So I'm just wondering what the panel think, you know, whether that language it sort of hides the complexity of what's actually happening.
Yeah, I have very strong views on this. I think it's a really interesting one. And I think there's an academic at Goldsmiths called Sarah Kember who talks a lot about the sort of the use of transparency as a, you know, vision, like all sort of text stuff is written through a vision transparency. I think one of the things that will be helpful for people to know and to understand is that writing something that is very simple has taken a lot of work and hides a lot of stuff. And that's one of those things where that's always a surprise to me that it is not. And as someone who's been part of crafting very simplistic sounding messages for a long time, I was surprised to see that, and I think that's one of those humility things that you were talking about. It's like, oh dear, we may have simplified this more than it's real. But I think voice is going to change a lot of that. I think basically there will be a greater appetite for complexity in web sources because so much of our interaction will be voice-based. I think that will be a really interesting shift. And I think a lot of the voice-based interaction will probably be, you know, either they make us entirely post-literate or, you know, we have some balance.
There is kind of a really interesting balance there, isn't there? Because the terms and conditions of PayPal along with Hamlet, so it's like on one hand you have this incredible legal over complexity that nobody on reads, and on the other hand you have this like faux naive kind of teeth that all those companies use. And I think Dara comes on really work and compare on something, you know, for the most part, silly things, not silly things, but you know, things like cookies, you know, affecting the price of the items you're seeing as you travel around the web, you know, I have no idea about that. I've been working in tech for a long time. So I think there's something around, you know, this sort of question. There are very few people who work in tech who are good with words, that's why it's a good job. And, you know, that's really interesting, right? Is that on the one hand, you have an industry that doesn't always value words, but on the other hand, you have the communication that we're given. It seems simplistic and folksy and cutesy and friendly and mother-like, you know, in a way the technology itself isn't always.
Yeah, there's interesting debates within the technical community going on now about the meaning of terms like fairness, which to some people seems like a very simple notion. But there's a great talk online from a computer scientist at Princeton, Arvind Narayana, sort of analyzing, I think he calls them 21 different conceptions of fairness that can have meaning in the context of computer science and machine learning. And so this notion of, as you said, there's an incentive to want to be clear, and if you give 21 different meanings of something, it's not digestible by the average person. So there is a need in certain contexts to communicate in succinct and somewhat simple ways, but we have to have the humility to understand that that's always going to conceal a lot of sort of deeper complexity. And as designers and marketers, we have to be sensitive to the effect of our words. One of the things that really strikes me is the way in which AI is being talked about and marketed in ways that seem specifically designed to get us to trust it with things that it's incapable of caring for. So when we're told, you know, that a technology understands our requests, or it knows what we're feeling, right? These are very dangerous and seductive ways to describe machines, because humans will anthropomorphize anything. I mean, how many of you, have decided at some point that your car or your laptop had it out for you, or, and there have been tons of studies about humans' tendency to anthropomorphize objects and attribute to them a broad range of capacities on the basis of very thin behavioral cues. And that's something that I worry about a great deal. It's something that's understandable. You want to promote the technology as something trustworthy, as something benevolent, as something that will help you. But we have to be very careful about how we use words, and we have to be able to understand the ways in which we're likely being misunderstood.
Well, the only thing I was going to add is back to my kind of earlier question. I don't think it's energy specific or our time, because we've always, people can add the kind of advertising, and people love slogans and shortcuts, and then human behaviour is we love them because it's a heuristic, it's shortcuts to understand something. You don't have to then process each time you deal with it. Whether it's, John Lewis is never known the unsolved, or, the companies have used them for decades and decades.
I think, to that point, actually, as well, I'm speaking of something about this need for simplicity as well. Something, Danielle Allen, who I think is at Harvard now, is an academic. One of the things she writes about is actually one of the brilliant things about the American Constitution is that it could be read and understood readily, right? That there is also something, on the flip side, there is also something very democratic about using simple languages to introduce people and bring people along to difficult concepts. I think that's true. I think one of the things that's interesting is looking in tech companies and also in big companies is that it's one of those things that people always talk about strategy as being like a war thing, right? It's like Marshall planning and all that. You can do exactly the same work in thinking, talking about gardening, right? You're just like, this like unexpected wind coming in, like that's what we're going to do. You can do all of that. I've tried it, it works just as well. But the sort of cultures within some of these companies sometimes means that you don't have that. So.
Any questions before?
Thanks. Hi, Simon. I really enjoyed the talk. Democracy seems to come up quite a lot tonight, and I'm interested in the idea of how machines might be able to enhance democracy in the sense that humans are quite distracted we got a lot of time to research, quite tribalistic, machines are potentially able to forecast different scenarios and give us direction, how much we can trust that. I'm aware of something called Progressive Alliance, which is a tool we can use to decide who to vote for. I just wondered what the panel thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, and I think to your point, these ideals that we had about how technology will fuel democratic sentiments and capacities wasn't a complete fantasy, right? Many of those prospects are actually still open to us, but again, it's about having the right design incentives to make sure that the values of the system are aligned with the larger democratic values that you're aiming for. And one of the things that I think your question gestures to is that humans already have a lot of thought patterns that are inherently anti-democratic. And we have a lot of cognitive biases that get in the way of effective collective deliberation, that get in the way of having anything like an objective perspective on our community and what its values are. And that's why I think, for example, the gamification of some of these tools to distort what people believe. I mean, this is what you see happening with the election interference, right? In the United States and the UK, is foreign actors actually saying, we can use these tools to stick wrenches into the gears of a democracy simply by distorting people's perceptions of what others believe. But you could very well have actors doing exactly the opposite, right? Designing technologies to correct some of the errors and biases that a community already is subject to. So the technology has this potential, absolutely. It's about whose hands the technology is in, and what are the incentives that determine what ends those technologies are put to.
I guess one of the things I would say with that is, I think one of the things we see with those elections is that they also emphasize actually how undemocratic the systems we already have were, right? It is that sort of thing where we say that everybody has a vote and everybody can run for office, but realistically, not everybody can run for senior office. It is so expensive. You need so much, have needed so much legal support. And that sort of thing is really interesting to see in the United States, actually. How much family members are involved with it. And just the, the risk of like reputational damage is so extreme and has been for a long time. And I think one of the things that will be interesting to see is whether or not this like lack of digital understanding among senior politicians will mean that young politicians will be coming up from sort of unexpected.
We've seen that in the
We're seeing it a little bit.
I was just thinking of how she used Twitter, very young, I think 30-year-old senator, and 30-year-olds going for Congress in New York, and used Twitter to mobilize the community. But on the flip side, Twitter also has been used for far less democratic means in the last 6 months, I would argue as well. I think there's great tech in the space. But again, to Shan's point, it depends who's owning it, because if I look at China and what's happening there on state-run AI, that makes me very nervous, because the value system there is very different from what is our democratic idea in this particular country.
I think there is an opportunity for that, isn't there? That machines and AI and machine learning, it's very good at scraping data, bringing data back, and looking for points of truth or correlations of data, stripping out what's fake and what's real, etc. So maybe there is an opportunity for something that's a bit of a decode or a kind of what is truth from untruth. But I mean, for me, I'm quite skeptical that just is in the hands of a bit like the Schmidt. I didn't think actually that people would bug at that. Actually use it for their own device. I thought it was a good thing. And I guess that's my kind of worry around it. I mean, back to the humane things, you can't be the kind of open town hall discussion you're having with a politician and hearing them and talking to them. That really, for me, should be our democracy that we should go back to, and not let machines come into that space.
Can I really quickly plug an amazing company that I'm doing some help right now? They're called More United, and they're basically a non-profit political platform where cross-party communities work together on issues. They've kind of realised that tribalism is really problematic right now, so if you've got two MPs working together on what you care about, whether it's living rubbish or childcare. I just love London, they're great.
But also, I think that there's also bits where, like, you know, technological innovation can be really, really helpful and already is, right? So one of the weird things about having multiple citizenships, which I do by an accident of birth, is that you can vote in lots of different countries and then live in a third one. It's a challenge, but you know, what's one of the things that's really interesting to see, for example, so in the States, it's almost impossible. Like, you can register to vote online, but like they then sort of like changing your address online is practically impossible. And the only thing that happens is that they send you like a ballot thing, and then you post it in, and then it's counted like 3 months after the elections have gone, right? Like, it's not that helpful. And in the UK, you can now, thanks to the government, digital services wonderful work, you can now register to vote very quickly online, but the problem is that you can't really find any information about local candidates online, right? So that's a challenge, or it's hard to in some jurisdictions, at least in my
Or it's an opportunity for somebody who just like build it.
Exactly, should you wish to. Whereas in Sweden, there are lots of things that are terribly broken in Sweden. But what does really work is that because I paid my student loans, they know that I've moved, so they just send me my ballot box, all the things I need to know, all the information, and then they tell me when I should show up at the MC vote. So there's also that thing, and that just happens by magic. Technology.
Just taking this to a different kind of direction a little bit. I'm just thinking about DeepMind. They've created an ethics panel. They've allowed that group of people to go out and do research and start publishing their research. And yet, I think there's some issues around that because there's not necessarily transparency about where that research sits and what's happening with the actual work that DeepMind is doing. And I'm not quite sure it's true at the moment, but we don't necessarily know all of those people that are involved in that research as well. So my kind of question is, what does good look like if companies are trying to do this well in terms of bringing in ethics into their discussions? And in a world where at the moment we're not trusting, how do we trust that might be good? Yes, you know, because I think there's a dilemma, right? Going back to your kind of reputational risk thing, there's a dilemma that you do something because actually DeepMind has been massively criticised for the kind of the approach that they've taken, but then try to do something, right? So
I'm actually really obsessed with this notion of what's good look like, because it's a big thing for us. So my team, you know, as I said, we kind of work to invest to create responsible tech. And we brought out a tool recently called the FLOS. And it's basically a product framework that product teams and engineers can use at the beginning of the FE process to ask themselves the right questions. And, you know, put it out there, it's open source, completely free. And we've been testing it about 35 companies, everything from like tiny startups to Google apps. And what's really interesting about it is, this goes back to Eric Schmidt quote, the minute it was released, people kept emailing us with feedback, and lots of it was really great, but lots of it was, oh, there's this. And it kind of reminded us of the complexity of all of these topics. And I think going back to DeepMind, there is something really interesting around when a very large tech incumbent does this, right? Because the natural, particularly British tendency is suspicion. You know, it's happening to work, right? So I saw Facebook today released their rating trustworthiness of using their platform at 0 or 1. My first response was, nothing's that binary. But then I kept thinking, well, this is really hard to do, so you have to think about trying something, because all companies can do is try. And I think a lot of the complexity of these issues will have to get worked out over time, and that's what's the hardest. We've already lost so much trust in those big actors. You know, I think we're already at a place where who should be owning this conversation, knows what to care about, and I think particularly what does good look like. I would say that's a conversation that many of us have together from very different industries, but it's hard, right? Because everyone has a different definition of good. I know what my definition of good looks like, but that won't be the same as anybody else's. And for me to put my version of good on you wouldn't be right or fair, you know what I mean? But I'd love to get your thoughts on this. I'm obsessed with it right now.
Well, I should say full disclosure, I now actually, as of a few weeks ago, contract with Google Cloud AI as an AI ethicist. And so, and part of my role is to help them implement those AI principles that they released a few months back and actually implement them in product research and development. And certainly I'm not wearing my Google hat today, so I can't go into any specifics, but they're very much trying to figure this out right now. And I think we owe these companies that are trying a bit of patience, I think, as they continue to roll out these efforts. But I think we should definitely expect eventually that these systems are made transparent. Even if the specific decision processes can't be just transparent, we should be able to know what systems are in place to guarantee these kinds of ethical considerations are taken seriously. And one of the reasons that I'm optimistic about it is we've done this before, right? Every large corporation, for example, has a massive legal department, and the legal experts are very well integrated from the product level all the way up to the CEO. There are communication chains, there are procedures. Also, every large corporation in the tech space has a whole privacy architecture like this, right? From the executives down to protocols that are done at the product design team, reports or checklists that have to be completed to ensure that privacy considerations have been taken on board. Now, are all of those systems perfect? No. But I remember actually 15 years ago when a lot of these companies were first trying to figure out how to do privacy. And some of these same conversations were happening, like, how do we know you're taking care of privacy? Whose job is it? What protocols do you have? And, it took a few years, but most of the companies actually, it doesn't mean they're all doing the right things with privacy, but most of them have fairly transparent privacy architectures in place. I think we can expect 5, years from now to see a lot of these companies have a pretty robust architecture in place with respect to ethics. At least that's my hope.
So I just don't think they can model their own homework. I don't, it's never worked for any company, centuries. I still think it comes back to the question we had earlier, which is we need the apparatus of society, whether it's governments or regulators, to set some of those boundaries. And some, GDPR, we've all been through that recently. And even if it's the smallest thing of, saying, we're not going to send you any emails anymore once a month, that would be annoying. Oh, right, thanks very much. But it's a small thing, but it made those companies act in a certain way because the law had changed, and that was the boundaries that they were in. And I think ethically, companies will invest. It'll be about reputation. But it would be for those reasons, not because it's good for society necessarily. I think the only way we can do that is if the structures that we all vote for help us to do that.
I would just say, I think it's we don't want to make a false dilemma, but we need both, right? So as was mentioned, the law is a relatively blunt instrument, and by necessity moves at a certain speed. And I think you also need systems in place within the corporation to be able to make decisions when there are acute risks to the public interest, and you can't wait for the lawmakers to do their studies. Sometimes you just have to make the right call. And I think it's important that we make sure that there are systems in place at both levels.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the things that they could do, like living in the UK, I'm a little bit uncomfortable about a government which we have, which has no respect for personal privacy, making some of this regulation, right? And that's not me being overly political. I think that's pretty scandalously true. I guess I think that we should give some of those companies that are trying the benefit of the doubt for now. I think one of the things that really surprised me when I saw DeepMind's ethics board was that it was to me a very clear signal of who they thought was ethical. That was not necessarily aligned with my ideas of what's ethical. Like, I was very surprised that there were economists, but no obvious anthropologists. There were people from the World Bank, and I'm like, I've gone to protests against them. Like, like that. But I also do think that it is still, like, it is something, it is a start. I think you have to be in the company, as well as answering to someone outside, and I think having such a senior board outside was an indication that they do care about it.
I think we've not question.
It's more of an observation. So one of my concerns, actually, it's great to kind of try and drive a notion of ethics in these kind of massive conglomerate corporations. But kind of historically, we've always had a situation where, it's kind of the mammals and dinosaurs. It's a weird situation where you can create a giant structure and something happens where smaller players, either within, see the cracks within the armor and the fences, those things, kind of run rings around it and bypass all those kind of ethical and those privacy issues that happen there. But remember, historically, one of the fascinating things about where we got the press from was from people taking kind of what we now describe as kind of pilot or legal copies of journals that were being written and sent through the early press systems to their patrons. And then we have this weird situation where now we have the press fund. We have something we see as an incredibly kind of democratic model, and that's kind of a massive shift of society that broke those fundamental rules. And it kind of does concern me when you think about the ethics of these giant corporations, of you know, what are we allowing and what are we enabling there, and then we've got technological layers that will kind of prevent these things from emerging.
Well, I don't think that ethics is ever work that gets finished, and it's not a sort of system that you build and then you can step away from it. It's a constant, iterative effort to deal with challenges that are always new and always evolving. And so I don't think that will be any different in this context. Just going back to the privacy comparison, the fact that there is a maturing architecture of privacy management and security in these organizations doesn't mean that we aren't constantly being confronted with new avenues that are threats to our privacy. But I'm very glad, nevertheless, that we have some structures in place that are properly resourced and empowered to address some of these threats. And so that's partly what you need, is you need to build systems that are well-resourced and resilient, where they're constantly on the lookout for new challenges and new changes in the social and political environment that we need to adapt to.
But the opportunities at the same time as well. This is the word ambiguity. At one stage, those things would have been seen as custodial, virtual properties, and now we look back historically and see those sort of things that fund society that we haven't seen, society that we haven't.
Yeah, I guess I don't see the problem. I mean, our norms and our ways of adapting to the world around us always change. So the fact that something might initially be seen as a threat and then later we might incorporate it into a system that we actually think is healthy, I think that's just part of what humans do. And I don't think that's either better or worse ways to do it. And sometimes we make a mistake and something turns out to be really incompatible with any system that acts in the public interest. But in other cases, we find ways to take what was once a threat and harness its power and turn it into something that actually we can embrace. But I think that's just a fact of human social and political creativity, our power to do that.
Okay, we've got time for probably about 2 more questions from the floor. Yes.
Hello. I want to pick up on something Sharon you said about ethics in corporations, but contrasting that with, say, ethics in organisations like the military and, say, DARPA.
Yeah. What
is the drive of humanity in organisations, or what parts of it, or their R&D? Because we haven't, this is kind of looking at civilian technology. But warfare is a part of humans.
Sure.
But maybe that isn't human, but it's part of humanity. And how does that look at everything else that's been said, and how does that, in DARPA especially, I've seen there's so much money, and money obviously drives everything with Google and Amazon and Apple. They've got consumers and they want to keep their consumers. But these parts of the military that will exist across administrations, across governments, they don't need votes. Really don't even matter to them, because they will exist and continue to exist. So how do we force them to look for humanity and what they're doing?
Well, I think that's a great question. And I think it would also be perhaps surprising to some people to know that actually in many countries, that it was the military agencies and agencies like DARPA that were some of the first to jump in and start funding research on ethical development of emerging technologies. So for example, in the United States, DARPA very early on put money into trying to develop ethical governor systems for autonomous weapons, which is very controversial, right? Because a lot of us think that we shouldn't have autonomous weapons, period. But I think it's interesting that one of the first thoughts that DARPA had was, if we're going to have these, how do we make sure that there are ethical governance systems coded into them? And there are a lot of military war colleges, for example, in which military ethics is a sort of fundamental core training for officers and professionals. So I don't want to characterize the military as sort of inherently opposed to the ethical governance of technologies, but I think what your question poses is that they have a very specific charge to society, right? And so the range of ethical values and sensitivities that they can have is somewhat constrained by that mission, right? The mission of national security. And that mission can run into conflict with other kinds of values that we care about. And that's why, ideally, I think, we don't have sort of military governments that aren't answerable to other social actors and other sets of social values. So I don't think that the conjunction of military values with new technologies is inherently disastrous. But I think it's about making sure that those values do not go unchallenged when they conflict with broader considerations of justice and human well-being, and those kinds of considerations like human rights considerations that, in fact, many of the people in the military that I know are glad to recognize as constraints and actually want their government to enable them to respect, right? So the idea of international human rights laws as being a hard constraint on what militaries within any nation can do is something that I think we ought to preserve and expand. So, for example, I do think we need expanded international human rights laws around the use of weapons systems, especially those that have high degrees of automation. So I'm very much in support of those groups that are working with the United Nations to try to push forward international commitments, for example, to not allow autonomous lethal targeting or lethal weapon systems.
Okay, so final question, before we retire the drinks? Anybody?
Yeah. Thank you, Alex. Okay, so I suppose this is the last question.
So much pressure.
So you've got a room full of people here. What sorts of things can we all do to kind of further this?
Ooh,
If I go away now, what can I personally do to help contribute to this?
So I guess how many of you in the room are entrepreneurs or working in tech yourselves? Any in government? Yes, amazing. Any academics, teachers? Well, this is okay, so it's these kind of groups that move things forward, right? So I think first things first, we all go and have a big drink. Let's talk about this stuff. But I guess the second thing would be, I don't know, there's a lot of movement recently around intentional use of tech, and that's something I can think about a lot. Is okay, every day you're kind of voting for how you want the world to be, right? Whether it's scrolling Instagram in bed, that's 4 a.m. in the morning, you can't sleep, or whether it's, you know, the kind of companies you choose to support. Like, I'm just really big believer in personal action in that way. That sounds really silly and naive, but I do think there's something around thinking about how you want to spend your time, thinking about the causes that you care about, thinking about your community, and you have I was thinking mentioned in the particular community, so what could you do in the space? What other events could you run? What other conversations could you have? I think that'd be a amazing start.
Yeah, I'm connected to that. Just keeping in mind the power that we have and making sure we don't leave that power on the table when it can be used well. The sense that when it comes to sort of the behavior of large corporations or when it comes to the behavior of governments, that we're powerless, that we just have to sort of adapt to whatever the systems are. I think that's unfortunately part of why many of us were slow to react to these emergent challenges. And I think the public is now sort of woken up out of that slumber and aware of the risk and increasingly aware of the power that we have to, as you said, through personal action, to tell companies what we want to see from them if we're their users, if we're their customers, to tell governments what kind of constraints we demand as voters and as citizens. So yes, of course, that's always hard, but I think making sure that we don't leave that power that we have on the table is really important.
Well, yeah, I think for me, you know, all that's been said, but I guess I'm just coming up with the humanity aspect, the humane aspect, which is that we're very good at the critical thinking, the discussion, and for me, I think that's probably one of the most powerful things. is that we can have debates and we were active this evening. But and, you know, the more diverse opinions and conversations you have, the greater the depth of understanding. And the more people have those conversations, and more of the bigger bodies should start to hear this.
I guess mine is both sort of smaller and like broader, helpful, lessly than that. And I think the first one is question that the data is measuring the right thing if you work in technology. The data always says we want people to stay on this page for longer, engagement is better, and that means it'll get us more eyeballs. It means that people will do this. I think it's worth, if you work in technology, to say, is this measuring the right thing? And the second one is, and I think this is true regardless, sort of as much what the other speakers said, is invite someone who's not like you into the room, and into the real conversation. I think even the best of us who are like, you know, the best organizations that I see try to do co-design and the user research. But can the people that they're making things for always say no to it? I think that's a really important challenge, and are they always right?
Right. Well, on behalf of the group, just want to say thanks very much to Shannon and our panel. So, I'd like to invite everybody by this group. We should have a slide